Good morning. One of the... Are we okay?
Yes.
Yeah. One of the things that you will find about me today is that I am on a sugar high after that breakfast. Last evening, for those who were not here, and for those who were, here is the reminder, we were talking about the development of language with Homo sapiens, early stages of their brain development, and yet with the developing brain also came an awareness that they could remember the past, they could control, as best they could, the present, and they could predict the future. But with that came fear. And I made the point that religion is based upon fear. Then, when people were trying to, or these early Homo sapiens trying to make sense of their world, fear gave rise to the gods that they created. I said that we are looking through that dark glass and getting a glimpse of the infinite mystery. I said also that all expressions, explanations of that dark glass glimpse of the infinite mystery are legitimate, as long as they are based in and on compassion. Now, usually when I say the next sentence, people's eyes glaze over. You have two lectures from me today, and they're both history. Glazing? Oh, good, at least one. Good. As I go through the lectures, I think it's important that we've come from there, which is the early Christian following of Jesus, through to here. And we need to understand that journey, because if we don't, I think we misrepresent everything that Jesus stood for. So as I go through, all compassionate explanations are legitimate, but even Augustine, and I'll be saying something about Augustine in a while, even Augustine, who I think has done immense damage to the Jesus message, but even his insights are legitimate, because through his dark glass glimpses of the infinite mystery, this is what he came up with. That's not a problem. The problem is it became institutionalized. And I'm encouraging you this weekend to take responsibility for your own faith journey. You journey together with others, you share with others, but you are responsible for your own faith journey. We need to avoid the divisive creeds and doctrines, which is, they've come about by institutionalizing the dark glass glimpses. We need to get away from that. So, Lecture 2, Development of the Known God. This is what the church added in the first millennium to that Jesus story. And as we progress through this, I gave you 3 questions to think about last evening. Here's the 3 for this morning. Had it not been for the expulsion of the Jesus sect from the synagogues toward the end of the first century, would we still be worshiping in synagogues? Secondly, had it not been for Emperor Constantine taking over the church, how different will Christianity be today? And third, creeds, they capture experiences and explanations at a moment in time. To what extent are they still relevant in today's world? So I approach this session from one who loves history and who attempts to live the orthopraxis, the way of Jesus. Seldom get it right, but it's trying to follow the teaching, as far as we know, of Rabbi Jesus of Nazareth. And to be able to understand that, we need to look at this history. So here we go. Christianity has transformed the world, often for the better, not always. But it's now in terminal decline in postmodern, educated world. information that I'll be sharing with you today demands a whole library of books. So I am simply cherry-picking the things that I think make the point that I want to make. There's on my website and on Roger Ray's website, the whole course material is there, and a whole lot more information as well. When I prepared these talks for over here, I had volumes of the stuff. Well, I could only take 4 lectures from it, so additional material is on my website. Now, as I said last evening, we need to distinguish between Rabbi Jesus, the one who was walking the streets, the dusty roads and so on of Palestine. We need to distinguish him from Jesus the Christ, created by the church over the following centuries. And in our world in which we live, I am convinced as I look around that the message of Jesus the Christ, the message of the church, is increasingly irrelevant. But the message of Rabbi Jesus is a message of compassion, a message of social justice, a message of equality that is relevant to any situation at any time, which is why I endeavor in my walk of faith to try and rediscover the Rabbi Jesus and leave behind Jesus the Christ of the church. For those that want that, that's fine. But I've moved beyond that now. So, Jesus, Rabbi, wisdom teacher, enthuser, encourager. Isn't that what we are into as people who follow this dark glass glimpse of that infinite mystery that we meet in Jesus, Rabbi? And also, can we get away from the idea that Jesus was a Christian? That surprises a lot of people when I say that. He wasn't. He was a faithful Jew, born that way, lived that way, died that way. He would find, I think, if he came into most churches on Sunday, if he came into most churches, he would sit in the back row, proving he was really a Methodist. And he would turn to his neighbor, and as the creeds and the doctrines were going through, and as all the hymns, were, and the preaching, so on, he would turn to his neighbor and he would say, "Who are they talking about?" And the answer would be, "Well, Jesus." You say, "I don't recognize myself in any of that." That's how far we've come from Rabbi Jesus. And I think there's much in 21st century Christianity with which Jesus the Jew would frankly disown. He was executed probably around the year 33. We know the destruction of the Jerusalem temple happened in 70, and the followers of the way of Jesus, that was their nickname. They worshipped in the synagogues. They were a Jesus sect in the synagogues until probably the late 8th, early 9th decade of the 1st century. And then they were kicked out. Now, why were they kicked out? When you think about the Pharisees held on to the view that when they looked at their history, whenever they had rebelled against God, when they have failed to live up to the 613 laws given to Moses, supposedly, then they could see that they were overrun by foreign occupation, they were taken off into captivity, and their whole sense was, if only we can live according to the laws given to Moses, Yahweh God will send us back home and will give us the freedom and the liberty that we used to have. So their whole approach was, if only we can keep the rules, God will bless us with freedom and liberty. And here we have Jesus, who began his ministry as, I think, a Pharisee, a rabbi, And in the early part of his ministry, if you look at the Gospels, you see stories, whether they're true or not, the truth is in the story. Jesus is going around with his disciples, and he sends them out, sometimes 2 by 2. Takes us back to that lecture last night with the 2 by 2 in the caves. And he sent them out with the message, don't go to the Gentiles. I'm sending you only to the people of Yahweh. He was living the Pharisaic approach. If only we can keep the law, God will release us from Roman occupation. And then he met that Syrophoenician woman who came to him, a Gentile, came to him and said, Rabbi, my daughter is ill. Can you heal her? And what was his response? No, you're a Gentile dog. I'm here to feed the children of Yahweh, not Gentile dogs. And her response, you know it? Even dogs gather up the crumbs under the table. At which point, I think that was a converting moment for Rabbi Jesus. He suddenly realized that the exclusive nature of the Pharisaic approach, that was no longer good enough. He began to realize the inclusivity of the love of the God that he recognized. And so Jesus, after that transformation, really began to undermine the whole Pharisaic system. He invited Gentiles to join the sect. They came into the synagogues. Well, that was fine until after 70, when the temple is gone. And Judaism changes from a temple sacrificial base to a base in the synagogue, based upon the word of the Torah. And there, people began to realize, we're still in captivity. Is it because this Jesus sect is watering down our Pharisaic exclusive approach to life? And at that point, the followers of Jesus, Jew and Gentile, are pushed out, excluded from the synagogue. These people traveled across the Roman Empire, often to avoid persecution. And when they went, they established their little groups. When they came out of the synagogues, that's when the churches began. Now, when you think of the Apostle Paul, he was the one, supposedly, who coined the phrase Christian long after the death of Jesus. And he called a group, the Jesus sect in the synagogue, Christian, separating them from the rest of the synagogue. And why did he do that? He said, because they love one another. Now, I'm sure that others in the synagogue loved one another, but there was something special about the love and the compassion that the followers of Jesus had in those synagogues. So when they were expelled from the synagogues toward the end of the first century, churches began. One of the big problems by the end of the first century was that the churches, these communities, had become basically Gentile. And the Jews were no longer involved. So Judaism would look at many of their stories and know that they were stories. Gentiles come in and take those stories and make them factual truth, literally interpreted. There have been converting moments of the church along the way. I think that was one of them, that it lost its way by the end of the first century because it made new creeds and doctrines. They began to try and explain Jesus. His spirit was still with them. They couldn't understand it. They were trying to make sense of where they were and what they were doing, just as the early Homo sapiens have been doing. They created stories about Jesus, and the stories that Luke's community developed were slightly different from the stories that Matthew's community, certainly very different from the stories created in John's community. I mean, John's gospel is basically primitive theology. It's not history. Damascus Road, you remember the story of Paul. He was Saul at the time, the persecutor of the Christian sect, of the Jesus sect. And he's on this journey, and in the story he has this blinding revelation and all the rest of it. Now, again, just as Jesus was not a Christian, Paul was not a Christian. This was not his conversion to Christianity. It was his fulfillment of his messianic Judaism. And I think we have to see Paul's writings in that context, not as a Christian, but as a messianic Jew who finds fulfillment in Jesus of Nazareth. So Jesus, his message is continued through the first century. They then try and write down their dark glass glimpses of understanding, and then those become institutionalized, and things, I think, go wrong. Remember also things like communion. In the very early stages of the Jesus sect, they actually had meals together, proper meals, and there was no above the salt and below the salt. You know that term? In the world of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and all of that, the salt was very expensive. So you had the rich and the famous at one end, and the poor and the servants at the other of the table, and the salt was in the middle. So you were above the salt or below the salt. These meals quickly gave way to the symbols of bread and wine, because in some of these communities, as you read through the book of Acts and some of the other letters, you find these communities becoming gluttons, using this meal time together to actually reestablish the old order. And rather than sharing a faith meal, so that all, regardless of whether they were master and servant, whether they were male or female, all had an equal share, that began to revert to the old ways, as it always does. Those who, in those early communities, reestablished or gained new wealth and new power, instead of sharing it in the community, gathered it back to themselves. And I'll be saying this time and time again today, as different communities over the first millennium developed. As always, power will defend itself. Privilege will always defend itself. And that was happening in the early church communities by the end of the first century. Quite the opposite of what Jesus stood for. The great rebellion between 67 and 73, rebellion against Rome, ended with the mass suicide of fighters, Jewish fighters at Masada in 73. From the very beginning of the Christian Testament, there is evidence of blood on the carpet. And that has continued through the centuries right up until today. The inclusiveness of Jesus still, I think, is the message for us today. Those later leaders of the first century church communities were people who reestablished privilege. They were the ones who have taken us, I think, down a road away from social and political religious radicalism of Jesus and taken us into an institutional type of community of theology. So we come to Justin Martyr, born in the year 100, died in 165. He explored the idea of Jesus being the Logos, the Word of God, the living Word of God, present on earth in Jesus. But he said, Jesus, therefore, must be subordinate to the Father. Not equal, subordinate. It's around this time also that John's Gospel is written. How does it begin? In the beginning was the Logos. Justin Martyr, author of John's Gospel, different people, similar message. And then there was another widespread interpretation of the God met in Jesus, that of the Gnostics, Gnosticism. Mark's Gospel talked about a ransom. God had to ransom we, the people, from the devil. That's Mark's Gospel. So ransom theology is there right in the early stages of the Christian church. Gnostics rejected that and said, no, it's not about atonement, it's not about ransom. We will get closer to God if we know ourselves. The answer is within. God is within. So you have these two approaches in the early part of the 2nd century. Atonement, substitution, ransom, or no, it's about knowing the God within. Battle lines were drawn. Marcion, and Roger and I agree that Marcion is one of those great theologians who has been pushed to the side. We need to rediscover much of Marcion's work. He was in conflict with Irenaeus of Lyon because this whole process of how do we understand Jesus in this world that we're in? And Marcion stated that there were two separate gods. Can you see the tensions building up around the Christian communities? Two separate gods. There was a God of the Old Testament, the Jewish Testament, and there's a God, separate God of the New Testament. Now, I come across people mainly from a Pentecostal strain who say much the same, that we can forget the Old Testament because it's Jewish. We need to concentrate on the New Testament because it's Christian. No, it's not, it's Jewish. It's just an extension of Judaism and the Jesus sect, putting their own slant onto the Jewish approach to life. And these battles are going on. Debate about whether Jesus was God or man, or how much God, or how much man. God, one substance, but three different persons. Tertullian, born in 160, died in 225. The idea of Trinity that Christians take so fundamentally as the truth was never there in the beginning of the Christian journey. It developed, and people argued over it. And Tertullian described this Godhead relationship. It still confuses me. Distinct but not divided. Different but not separate. Did you ever go to, when you were young, at state fairs and so on, maybe you didn't have them ever, freak shows? The bearded lady, that sort of thing. Do you ever go to those? Do you ever see a contortionist at one of these things? The people who turn themselves inside out. And you think, how on earth do they do that? And then secondly, how on earth do they get out of that? Yeah. But how many of these early theologians, how many theologians today, how many pastors today are contortionists with truth? And so often when you get a contradiction in scriptures, they turn themselves inside out to explain why this is happening, why it's like this and like this. They're contortionists. Why don't they just come clean and say, we don't know? Let's discover it together. Let's bring all our ideas on this together, and let's come up with something that we might be able to move forward with. These early Christian leaders were pretty good at contortionism. Arius, a leading priest, theologian in Alexandria, rejected the idea of God as Trinity. So you've got the Trinitarians, and now the people not Trinitarian. In fact, was Arius the early Unitarian? Yeah, there's some nodding in here. That's good. You see, there's nothing new. We keep reinventing the wheel. Well, it's time that we just took a break from reinventing the wheel institutionally and take responsibility for ourselves. Christian churches began to polarize. Origen, 185 to 254, Eastern thinking and Western thinking. That is all about a clear distinction between God the superior, Jesus the subordinate, or fully human and fully God. The Holy Communion symbols continued until the 4th century Bishop Ambrose. Things began to change then with his doctrine, in which the bread and the wine was changed somehow in its nature. Didn't explain more than that, but it paved the way for the later development of transubstantiation. You know, the Catholic approach that something major happens with the bread and the wine, it actually becomes the body and blood of Jesus. My wife, before she retired, was a teacher specializing in assisting young people coming into Britain with no English language, to enable them to access the curriculum like everyone else. And most of her work was done with Muslim children. And on one occasion, she was asked by a very intelligent Muslim girl, probably 14, 15 years old. She said, Mrs. Churcher, is it true that Christians eat one another? That was a profound statement, because it points out the ignorance, and I'm not getting at the young lady, the ignorance that exists between all the religions, because we don't understand one another, and we jump to conclusions. And I would love today to have been packed out here with interfaith people, because unless we work together on compassion and social justice issues, there is no future for any of us in this postmodern world. And it may be different here, but at home, all the great faith, they are losing their young people. Even if they come as children, they do not stay into adulthood. We are looking at home now at churches where the average age is 70 plus. No children at all. What future is there for the church? Oh, there are growing churches. There are the churches that offer certainty. There are the churches that offer really a pop concert with a bit of simple theology thrown in. That doesn't last. They grow and they continue. It's like the old pyramid selling. You know pyramid selling? Yeah. And it's like that. As long as you've got more coming in the bottom, it doesn't matter how many you lose at the top, as long as it balances out. And one of the tragedies for me is that these churches count success on the number of butts on the seats, when success should be in the way in which we impact in issues such as social justice and compassion. And if our numbers drop in the churches, the Jesus story is always going to be told by the people who will follow his teaching, his orthopraxis. So the battles go on. 4th century battles, you then get Constantine. You know the story of Constantine? one of the leaders of the Roman Empire, the army. There's rebellion in the empire. He comes to a place called Milvian Bridge. And before the battle, he sees a fiery cross in the sky, a vision. And he says, that is the sign that the Christian God is on my side. If I win tomorrow, I will convert. And he wins. Now, historians debate long as to what his motivation was, but he became Christian. Many think that it was simply not a spiritual experience. It was simply to try and cement the fragmenting empire together. He wins the battle, he becomes emperor. He then wants something to hold the empire together. The Christian God is on his side. He won the battle. So he then invites the different leaders of these church communities to come together and discuss, because he wants an orthodoxy of belief. And there isn't one. Here's another converting moment for the church. He gets it wrong again. All these leaders come together. They have several conferences during the 4th century. What are they doing? The power of the church, the power of the followers of Jesus was being on the edge of community, but deeply involved in the power of love. And then these leaders are offered the opportunity to have the love of power. And they prostitute the church in the 4th century. They prostitute principle for power. And suddenly the church moves from the edge of society to the center, to be power brokers in the center. And what do they do straight away? They attack Jews and Muslims and other Christians who disagree with them. And each of the conferences in the 4th century, you have people there who, sadly, they are excluded, expelled at one conference because they disagree with the winners. And remember, history is always written by the winners. And then a little later in that century, the table is turned. And those that were expelled are now the leaders. And the old leaders are now expelled. The development of the Christian church is a development not of prayer, not of debate, but of blood. Council of Nicaea in 325. You know the Nicene Creed? Yeah, I'm not going to go through it, except, begin, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and so on. You come to a line there, God of God, light of light, very God of very God. That was not originally applied to Jesus. Those, along with other statements like God, Son of God, Prince of Peace, Savior of the world, applied to Augustus Caesar 50 years before Jesus was born. A hugely political statement. And it was made at the end of the 1st century. It was made here again in the 4th century. But that wasn't good enough. Nicaea was then, they all got back together again, and they came up with the Apostles' Creed. And so it goes on. It's always developing and developing and developing, but it's about power and control. And in the end, as far as I see it, creeds and doctrines are simply about controlling the people. We need to be liberated from that approach in our faithful following of the way of Jesus the Rabbi. So you've got all these different things going on about incarnation of God. Haven't got time to do it now. Augustine. As I said in the introduction, I think Augustine has done immense damage to the Jesus message. And yet, it was his experience of his dark glass glimpse, so it was legitimate for him. What is not legitimate is it's then imposed upon everyone else. And this idea that we are born in original sin, we are slaveries to sin. You know, in many Christian congregations, week by week, the people come in and they are told that they are sinners. You know, this is the church. The church, the place of love, actually sets up the problem. You're a sinner. There's no good in you. But if you come and join us and say our prayers and have your moment of conversion, you'll be fine. You're with us. It sets up the guilt, and then it gives the way to get rid of the guilt. I don't have prayers of confession in most of my services. I just don't have them. I refuse to have people think that they are always unworthy. Is it any wonder people are walking away from the church when Sunday by Sunday they are told you are unworthy? It is psychological abuse, and we need to get rid of it. Augustine did some other things. No time for that. All that is in my in the notes for this conference. But I will say this, I agree entirely with Jack Spong. You know, it's not about us being filled with original sin. Let's start from a positive. We are beautiful works in progress. We haven't arrived yet. We are learning as we go. But as we journey, we remain beautiful works in progress. How much more would people respond to that in church? Come, join us, because we are filled with the hope and the joy and the presence of that infinite mystery that we meet as Christians, we meet in Jesus. It has nothing to do with you are miserable sinners, unworthy to come here. I think we need to be developing this whole approach of, okay, we get it wrong. But we don't need to beat ourselves to death over it. Learn the lesson and move forward, because we are always moving together as people of love and compassion and social justice. The whole thing moved on with debates about, Mary, a poor peasant woman with amazing stories created about her. The battle, if Mary was human, then she is infected by original sin. So how could she have the Son of God in her womb? How could he not be born, free of this original sin? So debates happened over that. The answer came up at another conference, and so it goes on. I said yesterday, we need to have questions. The only way to move forward is to question. Question everything. Share our answers together, that we may move forward together. Roger, how's the time going?
You've talked through your Q&A time. We'll have to save that for the second.
Really?
If we're going to build a break-in, we need to...
Okay. My apologies that we've got to this point. Last one on Mary then. Mary made Queen of Heaven. That's title given to goddesses of the pagan world for many centuries before Mary was ever born. See how the Christian message has developed. No problem with that. The problem is institutionalizing it. I will say more this afternoon on the second millennium, what was added to the Christian story in the second millennium, but we'll leave it there. I'm sorry I've gone over my time.